Hello, welcome to this webinar offered through DairyXnet, which is a national e-extension resource. My name is Kathy Lee. I'm an extension educator with Michigan State University, and I'll be today's moderator. The title of today's webinar is Dairy Reproduction, Identifying Problems and Solutions for Your Herd. It will be presented by Dr. Ray Niebel of Select Sires. Dr. Ray Niebel grew up in Louisiana and graduated from Northeast Louisiana University with a degree in animal science. He received an MS degree from the University of Maryland and a PhD from Virginia Tech. Between his MS and PhD degrees, Dr. Niebel was a research associate at Louisiana State University. Upon completion of his PhD, he was an assistant professor at North Carolina State University. From 1985 to 2005, Dr. Niebel was a professor and dairy extension specialist in the Department of Dairy Science at Virginia Tech. Currently, Dr. Niebel is the Vice President of Tech Services for Select Sires, Inc. in Plain City, Ohio. His main responsibility is to coordinate the Select Reproductive Solutions program. His activities include conducting training seminars that range from basic bovine reproduction and AI to advanced reproductive management. So Ray, at this time I turn over the program to you, and we look forward to learning about problem solving in reproductive management of dairy herds.
Thank you, Kathy. And this first slide, and we're going to go through a lot of these different topics, is identifying problems and solutions for your herd as far as reproduction is concerned. Is I speak about it as many different pieces in a puzzle. And so we're trying to do, you might look at a CSI identification of what can be causing the problem that we're looking at and what kind of solutions are available. Before we get started, though, I'd like to talk about goals, key performance indicators, and benchmarks. They are different, and really this is what starts the investigation many times. Goals are target levels of performance towards which managers are striving. These goals are probably different from farm to farm. And when we first get started working with any farm, we need to ask what are the goals for that particular farm. Benchmarks are standards by which performance can be measured or compared and are not synonymous with goals. We should be looking at benchmarks that represent specific categories, herd sizes, such as to compare 2,000 cow herds to large herds within a geographical location, or different production levels to compare herds over 25,000 pounds together. So I'll show an example in a second where I get my benchmarks for various herds across the country. And really, it's, in my opinion, it's one of the best places to get such benchmark standards. The last one I have here is key performance indicators, or KPIs. It's a metric that dairy may use to gauge performance or whether future performance will be success or failure. When we go through evaluating problems and trying to identify solutions, we're always looking backwards at past performance. KPIs hopefully look forward as far as can we indicate, or is there indication that the future performance is going to be on par, or do we need to kind of do adjustments before we get there? So a few key performance indicators, because I would always like to be proactive instead of reactive, is a weekly hard count of new pregnant cows. This should be between an 8 to 10% of the number of milking cows and is dependent upon a replacement rate. Palpation pregnancy rate is the best method to measure heat detection rate and is dependent upon the interval between breeding to examination. The point here, if you were using ultrasound, you're only going to have 28 to 30 days to do the return to heat cows, where if you're doing palpation, it's probably going to be closer to 35 to 40. So you have a little bit better chance of identifying some of those cows that are returning into estrus. But two good indicators here for the lactating cows, equal to or greater than 60% pregnant at examination, and for heifers, greater than or equal to 80%. Then another one is the number of cows leaving the herd within the first 60 days of milk. This measure is involuntary culling and death, and is an excellent indicator of success or failure of the transition program. And we will talk a little bit more in depth about the transition program in a minute, but 4 to 5% by 30 days and 6 to 8% by 60 days is a goal that we use. A few more lastly would be in the production area, the butterfat percent for the first 30 days of milk Greater than 5% in Holsteins correlates with cows' metabolizing body fat and is an additional indicator of the transition program. And week 4 milk weights, by reviewing the trend or weekly milk weight averages, a 4-week comparison can be made between different divisions of time. This is another measure to evaluate the transition program. So to step back into benchmarks, I'd like to use the size, region, or level of production when I'm going to herd so that we can have relatively similar type farms to benchmark. The area that I go to is drms.org and use dairy metrics. You need to sign up and get a user ID, but it's a free service provided by DRMS. And here what I did right at the December of 2013 is looking at Holstein herds over 2,000 cows. And you can see there are 65 herds. So we won't go over it, but these 65 herds should give a nice indicator of where the reproductive metrics should be that we compare to when doing our evaluation. So getting into the real topic today is we're going to start with pregnancy rate, because if you look at one parameter to judge the reproductive program, it will be pregnancy rate because it combines both conception rate and submission rate. You can see that on the right I have voluntary waiting period, because I want to give a few examples, because this can be, many times a mistake is made by not using the right voluntary waiting period to get the pregnancy rate, the correct pregnancy rate for the herd. Here's an example of a PC DART herd that is 100% or practically 100% synchronized AI. So it has the weekly slanted dots, which indicates cows are all bred the same day, but calve approximately 1 day later from each other. And you can see fairly good compliance, but the voluntary waiting period here is about 72 days. Fairly easy, straightforward here. This was a little bit more difficult. This is a dairy comp herd, which looks like something changed about between June and July, right at this time period right here. And so if we look a little bit closer, in the first lactation animals, which we have here, and you can see up in the panel on the upper right, that the first lactation animals actually is a group that changed 1st of July, and they delayed their voluntary waiting period, where it was about 50 to 55 days to now it's closer to 75 days. In the next, here we have the voluntary waiting period for the second and greater lactations, the older cows, and their voluntary waiting didn't change. The voluntary waiting period changed a little bit from 50 to 60 days. So we have 2 different voluntary waiting periods for this herd. So the first lactation animals would have to be run separate than the rest of the herd to obtain the correct pregnancy rate. Also look at pregnancy rate in 2 different ways, by calendar events, which I have here, and also by days in milk. They will tell you something a little bit different in that by calendar events, when we looked the first time, you can see from November of last year, or November of 2012 to November of 2013, every 21 days, what is the pregnancy rate? Whereby in this report, we have the pregnancy rate by days in milk. You can see the 50 to 71 days in milk, the pregnancy rate was 21%. And in the next 21 days, it went up to 26, but then went down again to 17. The reason for this bump between the 71 and 92 was that's when the synchronized cows kicked in. So between 50 and 71, they were breeding off the second prostaglandin injection of the pre-sync off-sync. And then at 71 to 92 is when all the synchronized breeding came into be. And in the next 21 days, we're back to heat detection. Depicted here is where you go in the programs. On the right, we have the bred sum options for pregnancy rate and dairy comp. And on the left, we have the report 126, the reproductive management PC DART, where we can get pregnancy rates. And again, we can get either date or days in milk in either one of these. We can select for first lactation or older cows or what lactation is desired, and we can set the time frame. You can see on the PC DART on the left, it has 2 options, 9 and 12. And in the right, on the bottom left of that panel, you can see where we you can enter the date of interest. So you can enter the starting and ending date. If you go a little bit further now, if we're going to look at conception rates, these are in my mind, the 5 areas that have the biggest impact when we get called in, I get called in to look at conception rates. And we're going to break down the cow, labor, nutrition, environment, and semen as the major areas that need to be evaluated. I know this is a busy slide, but if we break down the cow and look at just as the areas that the cow can influence, all the way to the left is transition. While calving signals the birth of a new calf and the onset of the new lactation, it is also the opening to the majority of the disease events that occur in the life of the cow. A low incidence of metabolic diseases and metritis are key performance indicators that cows are transitioning without difficulty. You can see I have stocking densities, and a stocking density of no greater than 80% is usually recommended to minimize social stressors and assist in obtaining desired dry matter intakes. Transition pin bunk space has been shown to be the single most significant risk factor to poor transition because of the relationship in feed intake. The recommended bunk space for all transition cows to eat simultaneously is 30 inches per cow. Over and underconditioned cows are associated with impaired conception rates. A pre-fresh body condition score of 3.25 to 3.75, avoiding outliers is recommended. The loss in body condition between calving and first breeding should be less than 1 point and is an indirect measure of energy intake and return to positive energy balance. Lame cows under locomotion we have here have lower dry matter intake, subsequently lower body condition, poor expression of estrus, and delayed cyclicity. The lack of cyclicity is expressed as either low heat detection rates or low conception rates when time to eye is used 100% of her service. Existing diseases as we move to the right, especially bovine viral diarrhea, BVD, and leptospirosis can cause both low conception rates and early embryonic death. A common myth is that vaccination can eliminate BVD. Vaccines will not eliminate BVD, only lessen the number and severity of problems. Good vaccination programs are very important because they prevent wrecks such as abortion storms, as well as diarrhea and pneumonia outbreaks, but they will not eliminate all the reproductive losses. The only disease that decreases the likelihood of these occurrences. Bulk tank milk samples can be used to screen a herd for BVD, which can greatly reduce the cost associated with testing. If a pooled sample is positive, individual samples should be tested to identify infected animals. Urine samples are collected from the kidneys where the virus resides for leptospirosis and used for a test for primarily leptoharjo, being the major stereotype of the interest. And then the last one we have there is early embryonic death, and probably the one major research area that's being identified now and funded is in the area of early embryonic death. So some of the things I just mentioned as far as BVD and leptospirosis might be some causes there, but there's still a lot of unknowns. Moving on, we talked about the transition program and body condition score of 3.25 to 3.75. We talked about stocking densities of 80%. And postpartum disease, some of the we have outlined here is metritis less than 10%, retained placenta is less than 5%, ketosis and DA is less than 5% also. The picture on the right is one of the farms at Fair Oaks, and you can see maybe one of the ideal transition program areas that you can go to. But again, I've never been to a farm with good reproduction that has a poor transition program. So transition program has to be one of the first places that analysis starts. This picture here comes from Chile, one of my visits there. The cows on the right are the dry cows, and the cows on the left are the lactating cows. And I took this picture because it's so clear it's from the ration of the increase of the hay or the fiber for the dry cows, and then the concentrate that's included for the milking cows. But again, the transition cow index that was developed by the group, we have bunk space, pre-fresh, and both fresh cow pins of 30 inches per animal, minimizing pin moves, stall size, sand bedding, and being able to identify cows that need medical attention. So if we move on into labor and labor requirements, what we have here is AI technique. And under AI technique, we have semen handling, which we'll talk about in a minute, and semen placement. Synchronization compliance we'll talk about also, and I don't have any breakdowns underneath, but it's a little bit harder to analyze. We can get a graph like shown, a scatter graph like shown in the beginning of when cows were bred, and that's partly an indicator of compliance. But really do the right cows, get the right injection at the right time. And you can do some testing of using progesterone analysis, repeated measures to tell if that is a problem on the farm. Heat detection, I have visual observation in secondary or secondary signs of heat, and then reading chalk or paint. Especially in large herds today, a walk and chalk program where technicians come in and tailheads or chalk is a real common reproductive program. Motivation is a big one as far as motivating labor that they're up on new techniques or make sure that protocols are followed. Then time budgets, adequate time for labor to do the job. Systems for breeding, visual observation was where we started with AI back in the 40s. I talked about walk and chalk briefly, primarily with herds with headlots, but not exclusively, where tailheads are chalked, and once a day a technician or breeder walks through to identify cows that the chalk has been removed. Timed AI started back in 1995 with the development of ObSync, and today we have numerous synchronization protocols. Some of the most recent would be the double ObSync, which gives us, and you'll see in a second, some of the highest yielding conception rates. More recently, the activity systems, which I think there's 7 available in the U.S. today. And of course, there's natural service, which I'm afraid my company won't let me talk about. So AI technique, area of semen handling, and there's really 2 easy semen handling is thawing time and temperature. NAB, National Association of Animal Breeders, recommends 95 degrees Fahrenheit for a minimum of 45 seconds. Equipment cleanliness, when I travel with a technician, I think the equipment as far as it's handled, his vehicle or his or her vehicle, the way it's upkeep, it says to me a lot of how they handle their job. Semen handling after thawing, from the time it's taken out of the box, loaded into the gun, and carried to the cow. Maintenance at 95 degrees semen temperature. And of course, this winter that's been very tough, almost impossible. There's electronic gun warmers that most of the technicians now have in northern states in the United States to try to maintain that temperature. And in semen placement, the recommendation today is a quarter of an inch past the cervix, so depositing the semen into the uterine body. So these are fairly simple rules, but they're violated daily. So we're going to look at conception rates, and I'll show both in dairy comp in this slide, and PC Dart I think in the next slide, that we can look at sire, the stud code, technician, breeding code, times bred. In interval analysis would be the ones I look at the most in dairy comp. And in PC Dart, using conception tracker, again, we can look at month, week, year, service number, technician, sire, days in milk, and so forth. So either one of these, and I'm not talking about DHI Plus. We have, I don't use that program very often, and we have specialists in the Western United States that I lean on if I need to do analysis of records with DHI Plus. But I think it's very similar. It has similar type of reports that can get out when evaluating conception. So of course, easy one to go back to is looking at conception rate by technician. And so here we have in this herd, these are all real herds, real data. Technician that's just circled has 644 breedings, 15% of the breedings, and 19% conception. The full-time technician, which has 54% of the breedings and 2,335 breedings, has a conception rate mean of 32%. But the real trick is, I was talking about the total, but is the 95% confidence interval. So one can easily look at, does the confidence interval, 95% confidence interval for Jason overlap the confidence interval for the technician in question? So for Jason, the mean is 32, but because he's bred over 2,000 cows, the 95% confidence interval was between 30 and 34. Our technician in question has bred 644 cows, so his mean conception rate is 19, but the confidence interval is 16 to 22. So you can see it's a 6-point difference where Jason's only 4. But there's no overlap between these two intervals, so it says that there's a significant difference in these two technicians. So again, we need to do an evaluation to come back and see what's going on here, and there is a technician variation that's lower in conception. Conception rate by AI technician and by code, you can do some cross-references. So what we have here is on the top, we have the technicians that are doing the breeding in the herd, and then on the left side, we have the different breeding codes. So if we look at that, what's interesting is that the code of off-sync with no signs of heat, no standing, is the lowest, and it's the lowest for every one of the technicians. But it does account for a lot of the breedings. So if we go down here, we're talking about for total 516 breedings occurred for off-sync with no signs of heat. And that conception rate there is 24% total. When you look at for pre-sync, it's 43%, and for chalk, it's 40%. So the recommendation here is, do we really want to breed those cows that went through the time-day eye off-sync and we have no signs of estrus? Conception rate by interval is another real critical analysis. That here you have the total, and this is important. So what we're looking at is that the normal estrus interval is 18 to 24 days. In this herd, 40% of the breedings are on cycle, and a conception rate of 43%. If we look at the 1 to 3 day interval, these are usually cows that were seen in heat, and then the next day they're back standing, or more commonly in a walk-and chalk system, the chalk was rubbed off, and they came back the next day and it was completely rubbed off again. It shouldn't be a real high percentage. In fact, normally it's less than 5%, and it should have a really high conception rate. You can see here it's 3% in this herd and 45% conception. The interval that's really of concern is the odd interval 4 to 17, which is not normal. Here we have 11%, which is a little bit higher than we'd like it or recommend, but you can see the effect on conception. So we had the normal interval of 43, cows that were rebred the next day of 45. The short or irregular intervals were 18% conception. So again, a discussion on what do you see in those cows, what is allowing you to, that makes you want to breed those cows, but a drastic reduction in conception. Conception rate by times bred, won't say a lot here except that we look at first service probably up to usually third or fourth, fifth service. And what's unusual about this herd is that first service is lower than second service. First service conception here is 36, and second service is 44. And if you look at the confidence interval, it also says that that's a significant difference. Now, some of the questions when first service should always be the highest conception rate. In this case, we go back and talk about transition, evaluate transition program. Is there a lot of cows with metritis that's going through and we're not getting treated or not clearing up? So there's something about these cows getting bred, or are they getting bred too early, or do they have some postpartum problems that's delaying conception? And then times bred code, this is one with heifers. And so to evaluate the heifer program here, we're looking at first and second service. For first service, it's all sex semen or sex-separated semen, and then for second service, there's no sex-separated semen, and it has a good bit of time-day eye. And so the difference in conception rate here for first service in the heifers was 39, 37% for the utilized, so the TG, 3G, and then you can see with the conventional semen was 43, 44, 58% conception. So a way to look at conception rate for heifers by service number and breed code, cross-reference. So back to the time-day eye program. More and more, probably close to at least 40 to 50% of the dairy cows in the United States are getting bred on the time-day eye program today. So the first thing we need to do is, if we suspect the time-day eye program is holding back conception, is to review the protocols and timing of hormone injections. Those protocols have been designed with specific days, intervals between injections, and the hormones differences that we need to review. Review hormone storage and equipment. This should be an 18 gauge needle in a half-inch, inch and a half in length. So 18 gauge needle, an inch and a half in length. When is the needle changed? This is probably one of the things I probably see abused the most is many times it's not changed until it can't be shoved into the muscle anymore, but probably after 2 or 3 injections, that needle needs to be changed. There's burrs that go on the tip of the needle. Ideally, every cow would have a separate needle, but rarely does that ever happen. And then a review of compliance. Who's giving the shots, when they're giving the shots, and then if we're really concerned, again, with a progesterone analysis, either milk or blood, that we can send into a lab, and we do it usually at the same time we're giving injections because we expect a certain hormone progesterone level at that injection time. So what we have here is the source is Victor Cabrera and Julio from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and from their Repro Money Plus program, and what they have is a nice table where they looked at when did voluntary waiting should occur for these different sync protocols and expected mean conception rates. So I know most are saying, well, why doesn't everybody just go to double ob sync with a cedar where you'd expect a 50% conception rate? Well, one is the cost. We're talking about 6 injections plus a cedar, and other one's compliance. We have 6 injections plus a cedar, insert and out. Not all herds can do that. But these are the different synchronization protocols that are available. You can see most of them seem to work fairly well, but there are differences. So moving on, the next area is environment. And under environment, I've put facilities, time budget, and cow comfort. And environment, Kathy Lee and I used to work with an engineer, extension engineer, and his saying was we need to bulldoze the facility and build it on top of the hill. Well, that wasn't followed out very often, and that's not very practical. And I have to say that facilities have really come a long way in the last 25 years, that we've learned a lot of research has been done, and so the facilities have greatly improved. But we can look at, first thing I look at is conception rate by month. Are we still undergoing heat stress reduction or depression of conception rates, as we see here? This herd last summer, they were going along with conception rates 40, 45, 40, 40, 40, 38, 40, 42. And then last summer, July 21, August 27, September 27, but bam, light went off, and then we came back to October 42, 38, 38. So yes, there's a conception rate was pretty much almost exactly dropped in half from the mid-40s to the low to mid-20s. So again, the discussion on what can we do, what is the heat abatement protocols, what can we do to kind of alleviate some of this summer heat stress. So this, again, is a nice way to look at it. Kathy Lee actually put out in one of the newsletters from Michigan State a time budget that I show here. Eating times is 3 to 5 hours average, and that's 9 to 14 meals per day. A lying down or resting of 12 to 14 hours. Standing or walking in alleys of 2 to 3 hours, and then drinking of about 30 minutes per day. So we normally do time budgets as we look at time away from the freestalls or time away from the bunk. And so as the farms get larger, that walking time and the group sizes get larger. So more time spent in the holding pen, more time spent to and from the milking parlor. So again, probably not hard in smaller herds, but as the herds get larger, this time budget becomes fairly critical. Stocking densities today, my story is what do dairymen do when milk price is low? They milk more cows. What do dairymen do when milk prices are high? They milk even more cows. And I'm not sure we have real good research on what is the ideal stocking density. I have not been to a herd, unless it's an expanding herd, that is less than 100% stocking density. In the transition pen, in the pre-fresh and post-fresh pen, we recommend 80%. Most herds today are probably 115 to 120%, but recently I was at a herd at 160%. And they did see drops as far as reproduction, increase in mastitis, and that decreased intakes in milk production. But again, sometimes in an expanding situation, Stocking densities have to increase to be able to fill that barn when it's ready. And then some situations based on finances, we also need to have more cows. So for cow comfort, stocking rates, it can be based on headlots or bunk space. 6-row barns are a killer as far as bunk space and stocking densities. Stall size, we're now starting as far as in genetics to moderate the size of the cow and become with a reduced stature. But lung space and bedding is critical. I think if most consultants had their choice, the bedding of choice would be sand. But that's not what we have everywhere around the United States, availability, or that the facilities are built like that. So we still have a lot of mattresses. We do have other bedding that's out there besides sand. Foot care, trimming, and foot baths are critical. Many herds, the larger herds, would have someone trimming almost every day, 5 to 7 days a week. And again, foot trimmers as far as coming to farms, as far as doing that maintenance, and also cows that need to be taken care of. Heat abatement as far as stalls and holding pens. So if we're going to look at, the first place we're going to look at is a holding pen, because the cows are crowded together, and that's where we have the greatest heat stress. But we also look at stalls and overfeed bunks as far as maintaining or increasing dry matter intake. And then mastitis, we look at that as it could be also an indicator of cow comfort, as many times at overstocked herds we'll have teat-in damage and increased injury. And then percent resting or chud chewing with the new systems as far as rumination is an easy way to get a handle on that. And what we've seen with the activity systems that have rumination is average about 450 to 500 minutes per day that the cow spends ruminating. And from the time she calves, the first 7 days is about a 50 to 60 minute increase in rumination that we know she's getting off to a good start. And so that rumination is critical. And with these systems, it's easy to monitor. And what we found is about an hour, roughly an hour increase every day for the first 7 days of rumination. There's some indexes to go with. The cow comfort index, it actually measures what the cow is doing, her time budget as far as standing and lying in the stalls. The second one that's been used a lot is a stall standing index, and they both work. There's some literature that you can Google, cow comfort index or standing index. It goes through these two indexes. A lot of the work's been done at the Minor Institute up in New York, and that's got some of the differences in those studies as far as which one. I think most people, cow comfort index, but probably an easy index is also a standing index, because the judging are the cows standing or perching in the stalls, or they're laying in stalls. To get to semen, fairly easy category to evaluate, at least as far as we look at sex semen versus conventional semen. A few years ago, we had a real lull in the use of sex semen. Today, we're back, I think, most dairymen, and I think genomics has helped us as far as the use of sex semen, because who do you really want heifers from? And many herds are now looking for more heifers. The price of heifers today probably average across the country close to $2,000. So heifers are very valuable, and so creating heifers and raising heifers is probably profitable now over the last few years, when feed costs really was a main drain on the income and profitability of the herds. And then sire conception rate. So sire conception rate, you can see here that USDA, now the Dairy Cattle Council, puts out the sire conception rate. Not all studs report sire conception rate. You see here 2 of the studs do not, because they do not pay for the data. The studs have to pay for that data to get, it's all analyzed, but to have that released. So whatever stud, you can go and you can break down the category, but these you can see here from the ones that are 0 or greater, there's a large number of bulls across the 4 major AI organizations for sire conception rate. And then 3% might not sound like a big difference, and there really was, you can see here is what, 16 bulls available. So there's not a lot of sires that go in that really high conception rate. And again, this comes out at every evaluation, so currently 3 times a year that we get a new sire conception rate. Conception rate by heifers and times bred by stud. Again, we have here is, you can see the 507 is the sex semen up at the top, and the 7 would be the conventional semen. So the 500 series by all the organizations is used to denote sex semen, and then the normal stud codes, which would be the 1, 7, 11, 14, 29, 200 would be the common studs in the U.S., would denote the conventional semen. So you can see in this example, first and second service, the sex semen was 37 and 38%, and the conventional semen was 60, 50, and 43%. So again, a nice way to say, to look at. And we see here that the conventional semen is probably a little bit higher, probably normal, but the sex semen is probably a bit lower than we would expect. This herd was way overstocked to store as heifers, and probably breeding some heifers that were not in heat at time of insemination. Normally, we'd expect about 78 to 80% of the conventional semen conception rate for that herd to be translated into the conception rate that we'd expect for sex semen. There has been some improvements, but it's really not across the board, and the research that we've done with sexing technology would not say that sex semen and conventional semen conception rates are equal. Some bulls we've seen a drastic improvement, but I'd say across the board, it's still 80% of conventional. So there is a drop in conception rate. I think everyone knows that. The recommendation has always been used in heifers. We see more and more people using it, but if they do it in lactating cows, probably first lactation would be the only lactations warranted. The last area is nutrition, and I'm not a nutritionist, so this is going to go how we look at it. So again, we have transition, rumen health, and under rumen health, we talked about transition. Under rumen health, I have acidosis and ketosis. Under the ration is things that we would look at. We don't look into balanced rations. That's not who I am. But particle size, mixing and delivery, and manure evaluations are things that we can do to get an idea is the ration in line or not. Water sources, linear feed of water troughs, something we do. And then, of course, the mycotoxins, which we've seen over and over again. And the two that we really look at is DON or vomitoxin and aflatoxin. So common symptoms of acidosis would be low milk fat, less than 3.0, sore hooves, laminitis, cycling feed intakes, high one day, lower the next day, diarrhea, liver abscesses. Of course, we wouldn't do that until postmortem. Lower rumen pHs, less than 5.8 in 30 to 50% of the animals that are rumen amniocentesis, and then limited cud chewing. And then if we look at ketosis, ketosis usually occurs within the first days, a few days after, weeks after calving, characterized by low blood glucose, excess ketone bodies in blood and urine, and lack of appetite. And any factor resulting in reduced dry matter intake increases the risk of ketosis. An elevated body condition at calving also is a precursor for ketosis. So the particle size analysis with the Penn State shaker boxes, and you can see here the upper sleeve, middle sleeve, lower sleeve, what percentages. So what goes through, and do we have enough fiber, and the percentages. I think most have this. Manure evaluation as far as color, consistency, and content is an excellent one, especially for breeders because we're on the right end of the cow. There's a good sound biological basis as why manure looks the way it does. So you can see in the top panel, nice manure pat, firm, and then on the bottom, an example of diarrhea. Mycotoxins, as far as it appears that at least 6 kinds of major areas of mycotoxins can affect dairy cattle fertility. The aflatoxins are allanol, deoxynivalenol, the ergamines, oxytocin, and then T2's toxin. Controlling mycotoxin presence is therefore extremely important, and it may be a relevant cause of infertility in lactating dairy cows. This year has been fairly mild year for fall for mycotoxins. The year before, we saw a lot of incidents of vomitoxin. So in conclusion, the major areas that affect reproductive performance, again, I look at it as a puzzle. We went over transition, touched a little bit on vaccination programs for disease, environment, nutrition, people, semen, the cow, and cow comfort. And I think that is it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ray. That's a lot of information and shows the vast array of factors that influence reproductive management. I have a couple questions or maybe topics that related that we could talk about. So a herd has some problems or feels they have some problems with reproduction. What kind of process or stepwise approach? Where should they start first, or to begin looking at the problem or trying to solve the problem?
Excellent question. It's kind of a big part of what I do, but we try to go again in a team effect, team meeting, where we always try to involve the veterinarian. The veterinarian is a herd health specialist in that herd. So we want the veterinarian involved. We'd like to have the nutritionist involved. We also, the AI company, reproductive specialist, if they have an AI technician or somebody that like for us would be a reproductive solution specialist. So we go through and do a record analysis first, and all the parties would come to the meeting as far as where their concern is, what they've looked at as far as to go over. Some recent ones, and really what we start doing is to start eliminating things as far as the cause. So to run a bulk tank BVD sample, to run some lepto samples to eliminate that, to analyze the ration as far as presence of mycotoxins, to eliminate that, to go through a technician and look at technician AI technique. Again, so many things involved. The transition program is one that can't be passed up. But again, a team approach where we get many eyes to look at it and from different parts is the veterinarian, the nutritionist, the AI company representative, those three individuals for sure, along with the herdsman, to kind of put their heads together and then try to go down a systematic path of what causes could be involved and start eliminating things that we can take off the table.
Okay, thanks. Another question that someone has provided here, could you talk about the activity analysis?
Activity, you mean activity systems, or?
Yeah, I think that's what the question is. If you could talk a little bit more about activity systems.
Well, like I said, presently every AI company in the U.S. carries an activity system, and most milking equipment companies have an activity system. Activity systems, not all of them have rumination. Some of them have feeding time, and again, there's at least 2 that have rumination, and it's becoming more and more popular. And I think in the future, all systems are going to have rumination or other sensors. So the activity systems were really first designed to measure activity to determine when to breed, or best animals in estrus and when to breed. And now they've kind of gone on to other sensors, and the next logical sensor was rumination. And it's being measured in different ways, either by a monitor or a microphone that measures regurgitation, or by jaw movement in the minutes per day that the jaw moves in a manner that's identified through video cameras as being rumination. And so the rumination measurement, I think, has become more and more valuable. We've sold approximately 400 systems, and most dairymen say they bought it for activity, but that the rumination function is what made them more money by being able to treat earlier. When you think about it, the milk that's made today comes from the feed that was ingested yesterday. So normally you can pick up a problem about a day to a day and a half before you visually can see that problem. My real concern is the amount of time spent analyzing the data and the amount of data that's coming over, and it's going to take a little bit sharper individual to be able to do that. So activity systems, again, the price is still fairly high. I don't see them coming down because of research and development. I think the innovators are still the group. We haven't hit the main area of dairymen, but I see that there's a lot of different systems and that most of them do similar type functions.
Okay, thanks. I have a question related to AI technique, and a lot of people doing the AI work on the farms. What kind of things should herd owners or others, in the managers involved in the farm, think about in terms of getting refresher courses and that for people doing AI work?
Excellent question. What we'll do is come in and evaluate the on-farm technician. So we'll start it. Where does that person, where's the tank located? Is it well lit? Is it off the concrete? Do they pull the semen too high out of the canister, out of the tank? There's a frost line in the tank and we want to stay below that frost line. Then the thawing time, I said a minimum of 45 seconds. Probably one of the biggest mistakes we see is people get in a routine and take shortcuts or thawing too many straws at one time. So they load up 4, 5, 6, 10 guns, whatever. The most I've seen is 19 guns loaded to save on time to go out to the farm and start breeding cows. And the research we've shown is how many cows can you breed in 15 minutes. So if that inseminator can't breed more than 5, you can't use more than 5 guns. If that inseminator can only breed 2 in 15 minutes, then you can't use more than 2. So it really depends on the inseminator, but on average, the max is somewhere around 4 or 5 guns. So then semen handling, the big one we check on the semen handling, because it's hard to actually check are they in the right location. Because with somebody looking over their shoulder, they're going to do the best job they can to put it just past the cervix. But when you get the gun back, you can check to see if there's feedback. That semen that goes between the sheath and the straw. And there's only about, in a half cc straw, there's about 22 drops. So if you put in 20 million sperm per straw, 22 drops is a little bit less than 1 million sperm per drop. And just takes a few drops between the sheath and the straw. And that's really determined on how that straw is cut and the gun's loaded. So there's a lot of little things to look at, but start back to where the tank is, how many straws are loaded, how quick the cows are bred, and then evaluate, look after the gun after to see if there's this stickiness between the sheath and the straw.
Okay, thank you. I have a question now. It appears to be a specific question about cows, specific cow owned by this person. Question says, my cow conceived after 21 days of the heat cycle and then repeated after 10 to 15 days of conception. What do you suggest for such cows? Are underfed or have a hormonal imbalance? Could you suggest some critical points to look at to maybe help explain the situation?
Well, first, you've got to find out if it's just an isolated incidence or a common occurrence. If it's isolated incidence, it's going to be tough because there's a lot of things that can cause early embryonic death, and some of them is just nature's way of getting rid of abnormalities that's coming along. And what we know now is the haplotypes going from, with the genomics, we know in the Holsteins there's 5 haplotypes, and some of them cause early embryonic death, some of them is death later. And so the haplotypes have been identified. And when you purchase a semen, it should have an abbreviation if that bull carries those haplotypes. So that's something new that wasn't on the scene before. But again, a lot of times it could be that the early embryonic death, that CL wasn't large enough, and we didn't have enough progesterone to maintain that pregnancy. Again, is it an isolated incidence or is it a herd-wide incidence? If it's isolated, I wouldn't suspect disease such as lepto or so forth. But if it's across the board that we're seeing more abortions, we need to look into it. And usually if it's just 1 or 2, it's really hard to say. If it's a favored cow, which is usually the case, that it's a show cow or a 4-H heifer or something like that, then we'd look at next time we breed her, we might give her GnRH day 5 to 7 after breeding, because that has been shown from research to be better than putting to increase progesterone concentrations, and actually makes accessory or second CL to eliminate that cause as far as progesterone. That's not an easy question, and it's kind of hard to diagnose the problem without seeing the patient.
Yeah, and the person did clarify that it is a common occurrence in the herd. So.
Yeah, so a common occurrence should be easier. I'd say get the vet involved would be the key, because a lot of these things we could start eliminating some diseases, and then from there it could be something we've looked at beta carotene and some additives that we could get to maybe increase naturally increase. Could it be at a certain time of year where we have I've seen barns up in Wisconsin where we have the starlings come in February, a lot of droppings on the cows and coccidia. Then it goes away when the birds leave. So it was very specific. I've seen different things, odd things across. So really need to get the veterinarian involved and to start doing analysis to eliminate things. And we'll probably start with disease and then start going to some of the odder things that might cause early embryonic death.
Okay, thanks, Ray. I don't see any more questions coming in, so I'm going to say that we've handled the, oh, I see somebody's writing and doing another comment here, I think, so I'll wait just a second. I will at this time, though, take opportunity to just encourage everybody. The slide that you see on your screen right now, there's a link there. We'd like you to take opportunity to complete that survey. It's just a very short survey, and the information we get back will be helpful to help improve the quality of our future Dairy XNet webinars, and then also identify topics for future webinars. I'll wait just a second here yet. Okay, so continuing on with that question, the person is wondering if aflatoxins or the ZON may be the cause of the problems that he described earlier.
Yep, if it's a herd situation, it could be. We've seen that, and again, it's an easy one to test. Taking a sample, though, is a little bit more complicated. What we normally would recommend was to follow the mixer wagon. So when the feed's put out, is to go and grab a sample, put it in a sleeve or a bucket about every maybe 20 paces, and do it 3 days in a row. Then take those 3 samples. So after you got a sample, put it in the fridge, and then after 3 days, take those and mix it together. Because we're looking almost for a needle in a haystack. So one cow could be ingesting ration with mycotoxin contamination. The cow right next to her could be lucky enough not to. So we're really trying to get the best representative sample we can. And the better job we do of taking a representative sample, the better job we have of trying to identify, unless it's a really, really high level. And this herd might have a high level if their abortions are occurring like that. But this is an easy one to, easier one to check off as far as is it a cause of mycotoxin. But we have seen that as a cause of early embryonic death.
Okay. I had a question here. A person asked if the slides are available aside from the recording, and the slides will be available. They're available through the slideshare.com system. And if you go into the link for the archived webinars, you'll also see a link for the slides themselves. So that'll be how you can anyone that's listening can access those. Right, we're getting another response back from the person you've been addressing, Ray. So we'll wait just a second here and see.
Okay.
Okay, and the person is actually said the AFB1 for the TMR is 50 parts per billion. So I'm wondering if this particular issue the conversation could maybe continue through a individual email or?
Yep, that'd be fine. Yeah, Kathy, if you know the person, you can just give them my email address and we can continue the conversation.
Okay. Ray, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and the information that you've presented.